The Preston Art Center, serving the Kentuckiana area since 1941.
Well, we're here talking with Jay Leiston, comic book artist. Is that?
Yeah.
Who lives in Louisville and will be participating in the Derby City Comic Con June 29th at the Convention Center. I wanted to talk about your work. Now, people who are familiar with comics, reading comics, know that there's different phases to the artwork.
Sure.
And you do various ones, but you're primarily what's called an inker.
Yes.
But talk to us a little bit about what does that mean, like to be just an inker? Like, what do you get and then send off?
So it begins with the writer and the editor coming up with a general plot line that they send off to a penciler, who in turn does the character design, lays out the page, gets everything in order, so that the page reads clearly. It's kind of like what a director would do on a film. And I kind of plug in, you might say, the lighting guy, special effects guy. I kind of fill multiple roles, kind of assisting him in getting a final product done that is clear to read in black and white. Sometimes I'll do gray tone painting and things like that to accent a specific area. That's actually kind of my specialty, is the gray tone washes and things like that. And at that point, when I'm done with it, it's what's called final line art. That goes off to a colorist who then does digital color to get the 4-color separations and all the nice extra lighting work that's done in the colors.
You talk about having like a specialty of the gray washing.
Yeah.
Do they make specific requests to you in what you do, or do you have a lot of freedom in what you can apply to them? Look at your stage.
Fairly free to do whatever I like at this point. Typically, I work with my friend Greg, who we've worked together and known each other for close to 20 years. I've worked with him.
Greg Land.
Yeah, and I've worked with him specifically since 2002. And so what ends up happening a lot of times is they'll have a new artist come in who either has a style similar or has some quirks that I'm particularly good at correcting. And so they'll pair us up. Typically I'm working with a new person to make them one step better. And with Greg, we kind of have a symbiotic relationship where he can now turn in a little less work and I can carry the load a little bit more, so that we can achieve some life balance, essentially. Because the penciling job is by far the most time-intensive page to page. And those guys usually are clocking 12 to 16 hours on one page, whereas I may do somewhere between 4 and 10. So I can handle either 2 artists or assist another artist and let them back down on their timeline.
Now, occasionally do you do your own? Do you pencil sometimes for your stories?
Yeah. I've only done published comics. I've only done 4 jobs as a penciler. I've done several jobs as what's called a finisher, wherein the penciler only does a layout, wherein the figures are in the correct place, the anatomy is roughly correct, costume's not really in place, hair and lighting and all that stuff is completely out the window. It's really just the structure itself. So it's my job then to take that extra time that he didn't have to make it look like his work, which is a little tricky because I may get a finishing job with a guy who's a cartoonist, not a realist, and that's more my focus. But I can still make that work if I have enough reference to work with that artist.
And you're working for Marvel, which means you've actually had a chance to work with some fairly iconic titles, iconic characters. Like, for example, you're working on Iron Man right now.
Yeah.
You've done X-Men.
Yeah, I did X-Men for a little over 5 years. I actually did both X-Men titles for 2 years.
Does that ever, the fact that you're working with something that's so well known, it's had such a history, does that ever inform the choices you make creatively in what you're doing?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, you're upholding a certain standard that's existed in the case of the X-Men for almost 50 years. 62, 63, I guess it has been actually 50 years at this point.
Do you feel obliged to pick up on the influences or styles of previous artists in those cases?
Not a lot. That does happen from time to time, like where you want to do a specific homage, where like when we did the Fantastic Four for a little while, Greg really wanted to call back to Jack Kirby, who was the guy who started the Fantastic Four. So the Thing character was always done as close to a Jack Kirby style as possible. Lots of big chunky lines and all these odd lighting choices that made shapes that just kind of stick out like broken concrete. So every now and then we'll kind of do something like that where we're specifically calling back to it. I actually did for issue 9 of Iron Man, we did a retrospective where we did 9 different Iron Man heads on this baby, because it was an origin story for Tony Stark. And so I got to ink 9 different eras over the same structure, essentially. So I just went back in and changed the style on it so that it fit the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, 70s. And just kind of inked it in different ways and slightly changed the design to match whoever was doing it at the time.
We were talking earlier about the fact that you live in Louisville and can be doing this work for one of the 2 major publishers, and how that's changed. It's become very easy for people to live outside of major markets or larger cities and be a part of this.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how does that happen? How does that work? And how does the communication work? And what are the kind of things you have to do to...
So there's a couple of things that we do. We work a lot by email. I get files emailed to me, and then when I'm finished, I throw it on the scanner and email it to the colorist, and also simultaneously the letterer and the editor, so that they can see it and get the lettering started at the same time they start the colors, and which saves us a little time in the process. In terms of communication, professional to professional, Greg and I have a pretty good understanding, so we don't have to communicate a whole lot about the work itself. So we'll discuss general ideas when we're launching a title, and then after that, it's kind of he's putting it in my hands to uphold whatever we discussed early on. With others, I'll actually use Skype and Google Chats, and we'll actually keep the pages up, and we'll show them back and forth and give each other corrections and advice to try and help everybody get better. And that's the real goal.
And Greg lives where?
He's in Tampa.
It would seem like the publishers would really value that kind of partnership, and
They do.
you know, because the comic book readers are not known for being lazy and not paying attention. They're very into certain artists and certain writers, and really pick up on the value of that kind of work. I would think, is that true?
Yeah, there's a couple of artists that are fast enough that they can support 2 inkers. It's pretty rare, but it happens. And usually you'll find that with one inker, their book sells really well, and with the other inker, not so much. And the only difference is that it's a different inker. So in general, people don't put a whole lot of weight into that, but when you start looking at things like that, you can see the influence that we have on the final product, especially with guys who are that fast. Typically they're much looser and much more free about what they're doing, so they're not as concerned with the specifics, and they let the inker carry a lot of that weight.
So you're going to show us a little bit of the process here. This is a page from an upcoming book that you just started to do the inking.
Yeah, basically what I do is I start with the big black shapes, and I'll kind of outline those to give myself a starting point. And then eventually what I'll do is get into the cross-hatching, secondary light source stuff. On this one, you might not be able to pick it up on the camera, but there's these hatch lines that are kind of set up in the pencils are a general implication, or generally implying what you would like to see, but not necessarily specifically what you would like to see. So what I'll usually do is look at something like, there's a secondary light here that's coming onto this black portion of this costume, and the face is sort of a light purple, and this is white. So what I might end up doing is something like, when I do this hatch to create his cheekbone, I'm going to do a series of lines that tie the 2 shadows together.
But some of the lines you're putting down are indicators for you when you come back later in the process.
Yeah, because with Greg, I do a lot of gray tone washes and pencil toning. So what I'll do is I'll do some really, really thin lines in an area so I can remind myself to go back to that with the gray wash. it's finished because it's black. I could turn that in and it would be just fine. But what I'll do is I'll go back in and add these washes to exaggerate a light source or to draw your eye to a specific area of concentration. Same thing with this one, this one's probably a little bit more elaborate. Here you can see, I went in and I did these super tiny lines that would have been acceptable, that would have been just fine. But then what I did was I went back in and painted a gray tone in, and then went in with pencil and pencil shaded a little bit in the face just to soften the tone. And the colorist, when he sees that, if I'm working with someone that I've known for years, he'll see the pencil tone versus the ink tone, or the ink wash, and he'll make the pencil tone, instead of gray, he'll turn it to a flesh tone. And so that'll create a much quicker way for him to get to his end result of making sure that the colors separate properly. So that's part of why we work so much as a team. Usually I start with the most technical pieces. Anything that requires a French curve or a circle template or something like that, I'll do those pieces first, just because that's, in a sense, that's eating your vegetables. Mm-hmm. And doing the faces is dessert, and then the physical objects with the rest of the work that's where you spend 90% of your time doing the page.
There's much more of a scientific process almost to the approach than I would have thought.
Yeah, it's an art, but it's also a technical skill. And that's this weird line that you straddle as an inker. Almost all pencilers are artists. They're not technicians. There are guys who are draftsmen that just, without fail, will draw the exact same face for you every time. But the guys who are more respected tend to be artists, and they have a tendency to be a little bit more free with their work. My job is to kind of rein that in, but then at the same time, maybe take it another step further. Typically, early on, it's mainly reining that in, because someone may get caught up in drawing something and not realize that they left a finger off a hand because it was really good to show them pointing and have the craggy fingers thing going on. But if you do it at just the right angle, this pinky will disappear behind that finger. So I have to find a way to get it in there so that the person who's reading the comic doesn't go, does that guy only have 3 fingers? What's going on?
Because they'll attach some significance to that.
Yeah, they'll attach a significance to it, or you also, it's like seeing a microphone pop down in the middle of a TV show. Immediately you go, oh wait, I'm watching TV. You don't think this is real when you're in the middle of a movie and you see something like that. It's the fourth wall that you're trying not to break. And so those little things are what I'm kind of there for. I'm a little bit of a visual editor on that level.
It's interesting, a lot of your references are to, when you talk about this work, to film. You know, you mentioned the microphone, and you talked before. And this is, when you look at director's storyboards, it's very similar kind of format.
Yeah,
so how did you decide to come back to Louisville? You're from Louisville, right?
Yeah, originally, yeah. My wife and I met in Tampa, and I was working at a studio there with Greg. It was a startup that kind of failed. But at one point we had 80 employees. We carried almost the exact same size staff as Marvel. And we just reached this tipping point where it was either going to succeed or fail, and unfortunately it took the wrong turn. So Disney bought us out during a bankruptcy, and I stayed for another 2 years, just kind of trying to figure out where I wanted to be. I ended up visiting New York and Charlotte, Atlanta, Chicago. Those are cities where there's just a ton of other comic book artists. And a lot of the guys that were in the studio with us moved away. Half of them moved back home, and the other half moved to places like Atlanta to start new studios. So we decided to come here for a while and see how we liked it. My wife fell in love with the place and haven't left.